cemetery outside of the Trinity Cathedral in St. Petersburg lie the great masters of Russian music. Rimsky-Korsakov, Glinka, Tchaikovsky. But the grave of one of Russia's most beloved composers is notably missing. Sergei Rachmaninoff lies buried in America. He was one of the last great romantics, a composer whose love of Russia inspired his music. Yet he became an exile in 1917, never to return. Many of his works became enormously popular the world over, but one was nearly forgotten after its premiere. A sacred work. It lay buried under the communist regime for 70 years. On this day, inside the cathedral by the cemetery, that once outlawed piece of music is being sung by an American choir. In a celebration that would have been impossible only a few months before, Rachmaninoff's liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is being publicly heard at last. This is the story of that piece of music, how it was created, forgotten, and rediscovered. It is about a cultural treasure which, even after decades of suppression, never ceased resonating in the deepest part of the Russian soul. The story begins with an American, Dr. Anthony Antolini, who teaches at a community college in California. Thanks to his combined background in Slavic languages and choral music, Antolini made a discovery which set him off on a long quest.
I was reading a book about Sergei Rachmaninoff, and I came upon a list of his choral works. And it included the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and I'd never heard it. I'd never seen it. So I started trying to get either a recording or the music, and I couldn't get either. And I wrote to the Soviet Union, and I got no answer. And I called music stores, and they couldn't give me any information.
Despite numerous dead ends, Antolini did not give up. Eventually, the trail led to St. Vladimir's Seminary, an Orthodox graduate school of theology in New York State. There he found a copy of the work in its entirety, though no one knows how or when it was brought to the seminary from Russia.
I was presented with not one copy of this piece, but 4 books. And I opened them up, and to my great delight, I was looking at the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom by Sergei Rachmaninoff. I began thumbing through the piece, and I got to the 6th movement, and I nearly fell off my chair. At that point, I knew I was looking at something that the rest of the Western world would want to hear.
But there was a serious problem. The score Antolini had found was in the form of old-fashioned Russian part books. There was a soprano book, an alto book, a tenor book, and a bass book. But because there was no way to see all the parts together on one page, they were unusable by most Western choruses. And the task of reconstructing the 20 movements of the piece, one of the longest settings of the liturgy ever written, was Herculean. What Antolini needed was a conductor's score. The trail next led to the Library of Congress. There, in a box of uncatalogued material, one of the music librarians found what no one knew existed, a microfilm of the conductor's score. The microfilm was old and damaged so that some of the movements were illegible. But with the part books in hand, Antolini was able to reconstruct the entire work.
I sat down, and whenever I got to a page in the microfilm print that I couldn't read, I used the part books. I wrote out the words in Roman letters. I devised my own system for that. And then in the fall of 1985, the chorus and I began learning the piece.
For several years, Antolini had been the conductor of the Cabrillo Chorus, a California community college choir whose 140 members represented a wide spectrum of faiths and backgrounds. In 1986, they performed the American premiere of the liturgy in California, and then captured international attention when Voice of America broadcast the concert to the Soviet Union. Soon, the group began performing farther and farther away from their Santa Cruz home. And eventually, the music led them all the way to this train traveling to St. Petersburg. Their tour would be groundbreaking. Never before had Americans been invited to perform sacred music, Russian sacred music, in what had long been a zealously atheistic country.
I think we were all really very concerned about what was going to happen. We had no idea what our reception was going to be. Here we were taking in a sacred piece of music. Would they be offended by it?
Well, we weren't a professional group going into the Soviet Union, and I was somewhat concerned that doing that many concerts in so many days, people would lose their voices and not make the best impression that we could with this piece, because it's quite a demanding work.
I was more nervous about the fact that we were performing Russian music in Russia. I would assume that they could sing it better, and yet the fact that they had not performed this particular piece, I felt that it was worthwhile doing.
The tour began in Leningrad, which has since been restored to its pre-revolutionary name of St. Petersburg. It was founded by Peter the Great in 1703 as a window looking on Europe, and has always been the most cosmopolitan of Russian cities, a unique blend of East and West. St. Petersburg is filled with reminders of the past. The Hermitage and scores of monuments recall the reign of the Tsars. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was both the political capital and the cultural center of Russia. And it is still a city where art and music are received by knowledgeable and appreciative audiences. The choir's first concert was to be given at the historic Glinka Capella, St. Petersburg's finest choral concert hall. To amateur singers, performing here would be as overwhelming as singing opera at La Scala or the Met. Antolini and the tour manager, Hugh Davis, arrived early to meet with the hall director and test the acoustics.
Soprani, alti, bassi, и tenori здесь. This is the first time we have ever sung in a place where they have built-in risers, that the building is actually conceived for singing and not for some other purpose and converted to singing purposes.
Благословено царство Отца и Сына и Святого Духа, ныне и присно и во веки веков.
Уже 2 недели тому назад.
The tickets have been sold out for this performance already for 2 weeks.
И проданы, по-моему, билетов еще 200 входных.
Over 200 have already gone.
Так что на концерте будет более 1000 любителей музыки.
Больше?
Больше 1000.
More than 1,000 lovers of music want to come to this, and so essentially they have oversold the house.
Всех желающих мы не удовлетворили.
They can't satisfy all the people that are lovers of music who want to come and hear this event.
Особенно большой интерес, как американцы исполняют русскую музыку.
It's especially great interest when Americans sing Russian music.
Хотя и к американской духовной музыке тоже большой интерес, но это уже не новинка для нас.
Okay, it's also of great interest when an American choir comes and sings its own sacred music, but of course it's a sensation when Americans dare to sing Russian sacred music.
This has not happened much before, I take it.
Это не случается часто, да?
Да, это вот в мою бытность это вот первый раз.
It's in his experience the first time this has ever taken place. Спасибо. Хорошо.
The audacity of the American chorus in singing Russian religious repertoire was not just political. It also flaunted the strict tradition of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, named in honor of a 4th century patriarch of Constantinople, is the communion service used most frequently in Eastern Orthodox churches. The service is the central focus of Orthodox Christianity, characterized by profound mysticism, observance of complex ritual, and a strong adherence to tradition. For an American choral group to sing this liturgy correctly was a formidable challenge, and in pre-revolutionary days, even to try might have been condemned as heresy. Sergei Rachmaninoff himself was not formally raised in the Orthodox Church, a fact which was to have serious consequences for his version of the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. He was born in 1873, during the reign of Tsar Alexander II. The Rachmaninoffs enjoyed the privileged life of the landed gentry, residing on one of the family's several estates in the rolling wooded countryside south of St. Petersburg. His mother, Lyubov, was a cultured woman who early on encouraged her son's prodigious musical talent. His father, Vasily, was a captain in the Tsar's Imperial Guards. But Vasily was also an alcoholic and a gambler, and by the time Sergei was 9, the Rachmaninoff fortune was lost and the family broken up. Sergei went to live with his grandmother, Butakova, in a modest apartment in St. Petersburg.
His grandmother took him to church, thinking that this was something an 11-year-old boy should be exposed to. And Sergei went to church not knowing what all of this was, but he already had a tremendous musical talent, and he always made sure to stand where he could see and hear the choir. And he would absorb as much as he could of what the choir would sing, and then he would go home with his grandmother and play impressions on the piano of what the choir sounded like. And his grandmother would reward him with 20 kopecks for his performance. And I believe that that training that he had gave him a kind of impressionistic idea of what Russian Orthodox choral music should sound like.
Despite his grandmother's best efforts, Sergei's broken home stirred rebellion in him. He played hooky from school, sneaking off instead to the local skating rink or to the Nevsky Prospect to compete with newsboys in stealing rides on horse-drawn trolleys. Threatened with expulsion from school, at 13 he was sent away to audition for the Moscow Music Conservatory. His talent was immediately recognized, and he was given a special scholarship to live free of charge with one of the teachers, Nikolai Zverev. There he met the most eminent musicians of the day, including Tchaikovsky, who took a particular interest in the budding composer. Sergei, in turn, idolized the great master, whose romanticism matched his own musical inclination. In this rigorous and stimulating environment, Sergei flourished. Rachmaninoff quickly became a legend in his own time at the conservatory. He was not only an exceptional piano virtuoso, but also a musician who could do everything: compose, conduct, sight read, transpose. His memory was remarkable. Alexander Soloty, his cousin and piano professor at the Moscow Conservatory, asked that Rachmaninoff learn the Brahms variations in fugue on a theme of Handel, a long and difficult work. Rachmaninoff not only learned the piece in 3 days, but performed it as if he had studied it at length. After attending a concert and hearing a work only once, he could accurately replicate it on the piano the next day, and even months or years later. Given a month to complete his first opera, Aleko, he wrote and orchestrated it in record time, only 17 days. At his graduation, Sergei was awarded the coveted Great Gold Medal, an honor which had been bestowed only twice before in the conservatory's history. At the age of 19, Sergei began his professional career as a composer. At his first concert a few months after his graduation, he premiered his Prelude in C-sharp minor. Its appeal was enormous, and in the years to come would rocket the composer to international fame.
Rachmaninoff represents really the end of the Romantic era. He wrote music that grabbed people emotionally. It was extremely emotional music. It has a certain typical Rachmaninoff trademark to it, but it does not sound original as, let's say, Stravinsky's music. Critics often hounded him that his music did not break new ground. But people didn't go to hear Rachmaninoff play new music.
In Moscow at the turn of the century, he was in constant demand to conduct and perform his own tremendously popular compositions as well as the works of others. By the time he was 30, Sergei Rachmaninoff had become one of the best-known names in Russia. In a country that has always venerated musical greatness, he was a star. And, as the American chorus would soon discover, Rachmaninoff's music still commands a great deal of attention.
Мы приехали к вам из Америки, чтобы петь музыку Рахманинова, Баха и негритянские песни.
A very mixed collection of people. None of them are professional singers.
First thing, in case you haven't heard, you've been sold out here for the last 2 weeks, and they have oversold the house by 200 tickets, and they don't know where to put everybody. Your performance here is awaited with a great deal of excitement and probably a large measure of curiosity. In fact, if you see the posters, your group name and my name are a lot bigger than Rachmaninoff. And when I protested, they said, everybody knows who Rachmaninoff is around here. It's the other guys we're wondering about.
I remember standing backstage waiting to walk on at the Glinka Capella. And the applause started. And it was a different kind of applause that I was used to. It was very rhythmic. And I came to find out later that that was their highest form of praise sort of their standing ovation. But it started before we even sang a note. And to feel that overwhelming welcome, it brought tears to my eyes, and I know there were many others who felt the same way.
Błogosławione Carstwo Otca i Syna i Świętego Ducha, nynie i prysno i wo wieki wieków.
I stopped worrying after a while about whether we were getting it right or getting it wrong, and began to realize that what we were doing was carrying out a mission, that this piece actually might be defined later in terms of ultimate performances, and it probably wouldn't be ours. But our reason for being there was very different from that. It wasn't to give somebody the definitive performance of what Rachmaninoff wanted, but just to do it at all.
The Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom was written in the summer of 1910, shortly after Rachmaninoff returned from his first concert tour of the United States. The highly successful tour included solo recitals and performances with the Boston Symphony, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and the New York Philharmonic under the direction of Gustav Mahler. And in each city, audiences demanded performances of the Prelude in C-sharp minor, whose fame had made it possible for him to come to America. Throughout the rest of his life, he would have to perform the Prelude again and again. Many years later, in an interview before a London performance, Rachmaninoff commented, "Shall I play the C-sharp minor Prelude? Alas, I am afraid so. People will call for it, and I shall feel it my business to play it. But oh, how I hate it." With the generous performing fees from his U.S. tour, he was able to become master of Ivanovka, an estate belonging to his aunt. Since his student days at the conservatory, he'd gone there often, enjoying his relative's gracious lifestyle, reminiscent of his own earliest years. After he married his cousin Natalia, he continued to return to Ivanovka with his growing family, finding refuge from the whirl of musical engagements which exhausted him the rest of the year. Rachmaninoff dearly loved Ivanovka with its spacious manor house, dairy, and orchards. As its master, his intense love of the Russian land was fully gratified. It was at Ivanovka that he began composing the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, his first full-scale Orthodox composition. The inspiration for it is uncertain, since at the time Rachmaninoff was not a regular churchgoer. Yet he wrote to a friend that the month he spent composing it was one of the happiest of his life.
I think there's a connection between writing the Liturgy of St. John and his first American tour the season before. We know that America was a tremendous strain for him. He was expected to concertize all over the place constantly with almost no rest. And we have preserved a letter that he wrote to his young cousin in which he referred to America as this accursed country. And he goes on to say that he is constantly surrounded by Americans who are in the business, who never would leave him alone. And I think it all kind of fits that after the strain of the American tour, he could be out in the country in a place he dearly loved and free to compose a piece that was emblematic of a very different culture. This was the morning church service of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is anything but business. This is a piece that represents Russia in its deepest roots, going back 1,000 years. And even though this was his own interpretation of what this music should sound like, it must have been a very satisfying experience to immerse himself in music that was so thoroughly Russian and so completely un-Western in every respect. It's got everything that Rachmaninoff was famous for: heart and soul and beautiful melody. And somehow the music is pictorial. You can see in this music something far more than just a sacred piece. It's almost like an icon in itself. It radiates something. And every time we perform this work, the group and I feel more and more deeply the inspiration which Rachmaninoff had when he wrote this piece.
In just 1 month, Rachmaninoff had created a monumental work, 20 movements, over an hour of performance. It appears as if the liturgy simply poured out of its creator. Rachmaninoff was aware of the strict rules which govern every detail of the Orthodox service. Eager to have his liturgy accepted by the clergy, he frequently sought advice from an expert on church ritual to make sure that it conformed. The liturgy was first presented to the church authorities for their approval in a concert setting, performed by the renowned Moscow's Synodal Choir. Music critics who attended praised the work as highly musical, containing operatic nuances and symphonic refinements. Expecting the clergy to embrace his liturgy, Rachmaninoff was stunned when the official word finally came. The church authorities rejected it.
The problem that Rachmaninoff had to face was that even though all the parts were correct, the style was wrong from the point of view of the clergy. It had too much of the spirit of modernism. What the clergy was saying was that there was too much Rachmaninoff and not enough church tradition. And I personally believe that Rachmaninoff must have been very disappointed in the reaction to his piece, and he didn't really try very hard to get the piece performed beyond its first couple of performances in 1910 and 1911. So, as far as Rachmaninoff was concerned, that was the end of the liturgy.
In 1914, World War I exploded. After 3 years of fighting, more than 1 million Russians were left dead at the fronts. All over the country, food shortages became severe. When strikes and riots swept the cities, the army mutinied. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, and the 1,000-year-old monarchy collapsed. The Bolsheviks moved swiftly and ruthlessly to seize power. When the revolutionaries gained control of Moscow, Rachmaninoff and his family were brought into the new regime, obliged to attend committee meetings and join the civil guard. In his memoirs, he described a situation which would force him to the most wrenching decision of his life. As soon as I made a closer study of the men who handled the fate of our people and the whole country, I saw with terrible clarity that here was the beginning of the end. An end full of horrors, the occurrence of which was merely a matter of time. The anarchy around me, the brutal uprooting of all the foundations of art, the senseless destruction of all means for its encouragement, left no hope of a normal life in Russia. When Rachmaninoff received an invitation to give concerts in Stockholm, he seized the opportunity to escape with his wife and 2 daughters. All they could take was their hand luggage, 500 rubles apiece, and a few manuscripts. As the familiar landscape passed out of sight, an era came to an end. Rachmaninoff was never to see his native land again, and the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom was left behind. Rachmaninoff's greatest worry upon fleeing Russia was the problem of supporting his family. But an old friend simply pointed to his large hands and stated, "There is your capital." Though a virtuoso, piano had always been of less importance to Rachmaninoff than his work as composer, and his repertoire was dominated by his own compositions. So at the age of 45, penniless, he prepared for the life of a touring concert pianist, learning the bread and butter pieces of that profession: Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, Liszt. With Europe still war-torn, he settled his family in the United States and was soon committed to a schedule of performances that was literally hand-bruising.
He had to give up his image of himself as a composer. And even though he went on until the end of his life composing from time to time, it was never the same. He had to concertize under grueling circumstances, traveling all over the world. And he became known, especially in the United States, as one of the world's greatest pianists. But he hated that life. He suffered terribly as a concert pianist. And it seems to me an incredible irony that a man could be so celebrated, could play to packed houses everywhere he went, and hate that life so much.
Rachmaninoff performed more than 1,000 times in the United States and Canada, in more than 200 cities, and he gave 220 concerts in Europe as well. About the life of a traveling performer, he said, "It is a life that hardly allows them a minute for rest and leaves them no time to observe the places they visit. They must always be on the move during the season. They are obsessed by catching trains and practicing. Almost every day brings another concert engagement which must be fulfilled." During all the years of his exile, Rachmaninoff never ceased longing for the Russia that had inspired his music. But the country he remembered had passed into history. Though he did write a few major works in his later years, for the most part, he put composition aside. When he was once asked why, he replied, "How can I compose without a melody? I have no country," he said. "I had to leave the land where I was born, where I passed my youth, where I struggled and suffered all the sorrows of the young, and where I finally achieved success. The whole world is open to me, and success awaits me everywhere. Only one place is closed to me, and that is my own country, Russia." To the public eye, he became a figure wrapped in melancholy, remote and taciturn. "A 6.5-foot scowl," Stravinsky once described him. 25 years after his flight from Russia, Rachmaninoff gave his last recital in Knoxville, Tennessee. He died a few weeks later, on March 28, 1943. He was buried in a quiet corner of a cemetery near the town of Valhalla, New York, 5,000 miles from his beloved Russia. Kiev is one of the oldest cities of Europe. Though it's now in Ukraine, it was once the seat of the first Russian state. And it was here in 988 that Christianity was brought to Russia from Byzantium by Prince Vladimir, who proclaimed Orthodoxy the religion of the Russian people. St. Vladimir's Cathedral is dedicated to his memory. The 1,000-year-old roots of the church made Kiev an especially meaningful stop on the chorus's tour. Just as in St. Petersburg, the reaction to the announcement of the concert was overwhelming.
The poster, which we have, was put on the outside bulletin board at Philharmonic Hall, and in 1 hour, a crowd had assembled on the street that was so large of people wanting to buy tickets that the police had to come and tell them to take the poster down because the crowd had by then gone out onto the part of the street where the traffic goes by, and they were afraid someone would get hit by a vehicle. So the police said, "Please take down that poster, it's causing a traffic jam."
The concert was performed at Philharmonic Hall, where Rachmaninoff himself had performed at the turn of the century. It was here that the chorus experienced at a deeply personal level the meaning of Rachmaninoff's liturgy to the people.
Most moving experiences I had was where I was just standing out in the lobby with everybody else, and suddenly I felt this tug on my arm, and I looked down, and there was this little elderly woman. She looked like archetypal Russian babushka. She had tears in her eyes. And then after a moment, she took my hand and she pressed this piece of chocolate into my hand. And she just stood there with her hand over mine, looking up at me, and we exchanged this look for the longest moment. And I just understood so clearly in that moment what it was that we were doing there.
It was an incredibly emotional and glorious experience. And they were so still, unlike an American audience that's always rustling papers and shuffling and crossing their feet and coughing. There was not a sound. It was an incredible feeling. And I have the recollection that I looked out on the audience and saw tears coming down people's cheeks.
We got to the 14th movement. It's an Our Father, and the words are Oche Nash. And as we were singing these words, the children were mouthing the words. It was one of my most moving experiences to know that the children knew how to say the Our Father, even though it was not recommended by their government, I'm sure, at that time.
After 3 generations of state-mandated atheism, why had Rachmaninoff's liturgy struck such a responsive chord in the Soviet people? The answer lies in the deeply rooted connection that has historically tied the people of this land to their church. For 1,000 years, the Orthodox Church had been the heart and soul of Russian society, touching every aspect of life from birth until death. For the common people especially, the church was the one source of beauty in an otherwise mean existence, and they clung to it with uniquely intense fervor. Until communism, in every village, the sound of church bells ringing evoked the strongest feelings of being Russian. Yet for all its spiritual glory, the church wielded little political power. Although church leaders were able to achieve some success in eliminating the oppressive system of serfdom, they were unable to alleviate the miserable social conditions suffered by the Russian people. When the revolution erupted in 1917, the Bolsheviks denounced the church as a symbol of the decadent and backward past. Under Lenin and Stalin, Orthodoxy suffered the most vicious persecution since the days of the Christian martyrs under the Roman emperors. 50,000 Orthodox priests, monks, and nuns were exterminated. The ownership of a Bible was severely punished, and religious instruction of children was strictly forbidden. During those decades, Rachmaninoff's music was rarely heard. The government authorities were threatened by the deep spiritual feeling which permeates even Rachmaninoff's secular works. Rachmaninoff's music was officially banned in the Soviet Union from 1931 to 1934. It could not be heard, taught, or played during that time. But his popularity could not be suppressed. And in the 1960s, when the government permitted a few recordings to be released, the public response reached epic proportions. But the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom continued to lie buried in obscurity. It was not until the Cabrillo-Slavonic chorus arrived in Moscow that the liturgy burst finally and fully into the national spotlight.
And when we got to Moscow, people from the group began rushing up to me saying, "The liturgy's been on the radio. It was on just before the 6 o'clock news." And they said, "But it's not us, it's some other group." And it turned out that the night we performed in Moscow, that night they played the last two movements of the piece from Minin's new recording. And the purpose of it was to announce to the Soviet people that this American choir, which was performing the piece, was not the first choir to record it or perform it, that the Moscow Chamber Choir had gotten there first. People kept saying to me, "Doesn't that make you angry that they're turning this into a speed contest of who got there first?" And I said, "Not at all." To me, the delight was that a sacred piece that had been held back from the people was played all over the country that night.
Поскольку в их репертуаре была литургия Рахманинова,
organizing the visit of the Cabrillo Chorus was very complicated, considering that the repertoire was the liturgy of Rachmaninoff. It was very difficult to assure the university authorities that this wouldn't turn out badly with the students and faculty. This was an enormous event in the history of Moscow University. I've never since encountered such a situation with the university authorities as happened with this concert. They even asked Antolini to repeat the concert in the Great Hall of Moscow University, which is reserved for only the most important occasions.
Cabrillo-Slavonic Chorus's performances of the liturgy marked the first time Russian sacred music had been permitted at the university since the campus was built in 1953. Those two concerts cleared the path for the performance of other sacred works by Soviet choral groups.
This all happened at a pivotal time. It was essential that everyone hear this music, and no one knew exactly why it was so essential. But it all started with the liturgy of Rachmaninoff, and it came at exactly the right moment.
For Anthony Antolini, the Moscow State Concerts had a special significance. He had been a student here in the 1970s, so to return as a conductor was a personal milestone. And as the concert drew to a close and congratulations and gifts were presented, an official of the university opened a case and awarded him the Distinguished Alumni Medal of Moscow State University. In political terms, the concerts at Moscow State University were the climax of the tour. Here, in the intellectual nerve center of the Soviet Union, a sacred work by a political exile had been given public performance and official seal of approval. But for the chorus's mission to be completely fulfilled, it now only remained for them to sing the liturgy in the setting for which Rachmaninoff intended it. On the eve of the millennial year of the Russian Orthodox Church, the chorus sang Rachmaninoff's once banned liturgy in St. Petersburg's Trinity Cathedral. In honor of the American group's presence, signaling the new freedom of the church, the service was celebrated by the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, soon to be elected Patriarch of all Russia.
That liturgy in Trinity Cathedral represented some of the most important aspects of our efforts. First of all, the American choir is singing Rachmaninoff's Liturgy of St. John, which had been rejected by the Russian Orthodox Church for its spirit of modernism. And so, after a very circuitous route, the piece is back in the church where Rachmaninoff hoped it would go in the first place. Perhaps the most important thing that that service represented was the fact that the church was open. After all the years of methodical punishment of believers, we have a cathedral that is open and open to anyone who wanted to walk in there. That congregation was not filtered. They were not ticket holders. There were no police outside screening who could come in and who had to stay out. And to me, that was of enormous historical significance.